Good evening, everyone. My name is Warren Smith, and I'm the Vice President for Mission Advancement at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And we're delighted to welcome you to week 2 of our 4-week class, if you will, on freedom. Can it be sustained? And I'm delighted that tonight we have with us a man who needs very little introduction, I'm sure, to the Colson Center crowd, and that is Os Guinness. Despite the fact that he needs no introduction, I'm going to give him a short one in just a few minutes. But before I do that, I'm going to just remind you of a few items, housekeeping items, if you will, that may be helpful to you in terms of your enjoyment and for tonight, and also to get the most out of it. First of all, I want to let you know that we will be taking questions. It's a rare opportunity to be able to ask questions of Os Guinness, but we are able to enjoy that opportunity tonight. And depending upon the device you are using, there will be a little tab on either the top of your screen or on one of the sides of your screen. And that tab simply says questions. If you click on that tab, it'll open up a box and you can type your question there. I will be able to see it. I will be curating those questions, and whenever the hour is passed and we are at 9 o'clock Eastern time, I will come back on and I'll pose those questions to Oz. We'll get to it. If you were with us last week, you know that we were not able to get to nearly all the questions that we had, but we got to a goodly number of questions that seemed to be the ones that were the most urgent or were asked by the most people. So again, don't wait until 9 o'clock to ask your questions. You can feel free to ask questions anytime during the hour. The second thing that I wanted to mention to you is that we are recording tonight's session. And tomorrow you'll be getting an email from us, and that email will, among other things, include a link to tonight's recording. And we want you to use that link in any way you see fit within certain limits. We don't want you to put it on social media or send it out to 100,000 of your closest friends, but within reason, we do want you to share it. If you've got family, friends, pastors, elders, deacons that you think would benefit from tonight's session, we hope you will share it with them. Again, we hope that tonight's session is not just edifying and educational for you, but also equipping for you. In other words, that it provides a tool that you can use with people in your sphere of influence. So with those two housekeeping items, I've got a couple more announcements that I'm going to say till the end, but with those two housekeeping items, I'd like to very quickly turn the floor over to Os Guinness, who I should mention in passing, he will be with us on audio only tonight, audio only. But we will have him in all of his glory and live for the hour and a half. Os Guinness, as I said earlier, needs very little introduction for many of you. He has a doctoral degree from Oxford. He is the author of more than 25 books. I'm not going to mention them all, but there are a few books that I think are particularly relevant to tonight's conversation, including his most recent book, just out, which is called The Last Call for Liberty: How America's Genius for Freedom Has Become Its Greatest Threat. And that book goes very directly to the theme of our short course, which is on, of course, freedom, and why it is so fragile and why it has to be actively maintained by the people who live in a culture that enjoys freedom. I would also mention that a couple of years ago, we had Os Guinness at our annual Wilberforce weekend, and he spoke on his book, Free People's Suicide, Sustainable Freedom and the American Future. So those two books are going to significantly inform our conversation tonight. And I would be remiss personally if I didn't also mention Oz's book, which has been out now 20 years, called The Call: Finding and Fulfilling the Central Purpose of Your Life. That book had a huge impact on me personally. It's a book that we continue to use in our Colson Fellows program. And Oz reminded me just before we started tonight that book is now out in a 20th anniversary edition, originally published in 1998, now, of course, in 2018, 20 years later, and he's written a couple of extra chapters for that book as well. So if you don't know that book, The Call, I strongly recommend it to you, and get the new version with the extra chapters in it. So with that, I'm honored to turn the floor over to Oz Guinness. Oz, please share with us what the Lord has placed on your heart tonight.
Thank you, Warren. What a real privilege for me to be with you wherever you are, spread around the country. I loved and admired Chuck Colson, and I've always been privileged to come on the various things put on by the Colson Center. So this is no exception. I'm probably relieved to be audio only tonight because I've had near pneumonia the last week, so I was coughing and spluttering. So I'm glad maybe it's just my voice only. But it's a real delight to be with you. Sustainable freedom. No secret to anyone, surely, in America today, that this is a solemn moment for the American Republic. If we look wider, we can see that our Western world is in evident decline. The so-called search for a new world order is faltering. People are talking about the Thucydides trap, which always happens when a reigning power is challenged by a rising power. And you can see that today with China. And as we look at the global agenda, you see various issues that are unprecedented and enormous. And then we look to the future. And clearly, what Francis Bacon called the conquest of nature has become what C.S. Lewis called the conquest of human nature. And maybe even, as he put it, the abolition of man. And at this moment, the great American experiment, as George Washington puts it, or history's longest-running tutorial in the art of political freedom, is suffering its gravest crisis since the Civil War, and we can clearly say that America is as deeply divided as at any time since just before the Civil War. So this is an extraordinary moment for us as followers of Jesus to be wrestling with this big issue. But begin first, what is the crisis and why is it so serious? You know, many people have different answers than that. David Brooks has said today that we're seeing a civil war of rich white men, which I think is actually rather ridiculous. The people are saying it's the latest episode of the left against the right, or heartlanders and the flyover territories against the coastals like New York and California. Or the last 2 years, the dominant category has been we're seeing a clash between the nationalists and populists and the globalists. Think of people like George Soros. But I think while all of those have something to add to the crisis, that doesn't really get down to the heart of it as I see it. And probably, as you know, I'm not American, but I'm a great admirer of this country as a visiting foreigner. And I would say three things about the crisis. First, the deepest crisis is actually a tale of two revolutions. In other words, if you look at issues like multiculturalism, tribal politics, victim politics, political correctness, social constructionism, the kneeing controversy, or the sexual revolution, or what we've seen in the 2016 election and even more in the Kavanaugh hearings, what you're seeing is actually, although many people are not really aware of it, you have, on the one hand, ideas that go back to 1776 and the American Revolution, which was decisively, although not fully, sadly, biblical because of the impact of the Reformation. And on the other side, and again, often unwittingly, you have views of the Republic and views of freedom that go back to 1789 and the French Revolution and its heirs of that stream of thinking since then, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Antonio Gramsci, we'll come back to some of these characters, Herbert Marcuse in the 60s, or more recently people like Michel Foucault, the great postmodern advocate of power. And that, I think, is the deepest thing. You see a clash, basically, between 1776 and 1789. And they have very different views of the Republic, very different views of freedom, and they end up with entirely different consequences. The second thing to say is why that's so serious. This year, 2018, is the 50th anniversary of an extraordinary call in 1968 for the long march through the institutions. You know, Karl Marx called for a revolution in the streets by the proletariat. There's never been one. It was a failure. And in the 1920s, a gentleman called Antonio Gramsci was popped in jail by Mussolini for more than 20 years, and he wrote famously what became known as the prison notebooks. And he argued that Marx was wrong. He was a Marxist. Marx was wrong. What they needed to do was gain what he called cultural hegemony of the elites. Well, his ideas were picked up by the leader of the Red Brigade in 1968, which was a dramatic year anyway. You can see a lot of the celebrations this year, or the memories of it, the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the so-called police riots at the Chicago Convention, and much of America was burning much of the year. But at one point, Rudi Dutschke, the head of the Red Brigade, called for a long march through the institutions. In other words, to win, they had to gain cultural hegemony in the elite institutions of ideas such as colleges and universities, the press and media, and, of course, entertainment and Hollywood. Well, looking back 50 years later, there's no question that long march has succeeded. And those three spheres are heavily dominated by the liberal left. And what happened in the 60s was, right until then, the problems of America, say slavery by Lincoln, or racism in the civil rights movement by Martin Luther King, they were tackled in the light of the Declaration. The Constitution, with its 3/5 laws, may have been wrong. It was an evil and a hypocrisy, but they tackled it in the light of the Declaration, what Martin Luther King called a promissory note. The Declaration promised it, but didn't cash it in for most people. And he said we should now cash it in. But in the shift from Martin Luther King to Stokely Carmichael, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the rise of second phase feminism, and so on in the 60s, somewhere around 68, the same year as Rudi Dutschke, there was a fatal lurch left in a big way. America had always been a liberal project with a capital L, but much closer to 19th century liberalism, the importance of freedom for the individual over against the government. But then around 68, you had the new story that America was basically racist, sexist, militarist, you name it. And from then onwards, that long march has solidified the view that is basically countercultural to America. And you can see today how important that's become. Well, add in the third reason why that's so important. Today, one of the crucial differences from the 1850s and early 60s is there's no Lincoln-like leader addressing what Lincoln called the better angels of the American nature. And you remember when Lincoln was elected president, he went from Springfield, Illinois, through Philadelphia on his way to Washington in February 1861, and he made a number of remarks and speeches around Independence Hall. And he said, in essence, all his thinking had come from the documents in that building, and he finished quoting Psalm 137, "May my right hand forget its skill, and may my mouth cleave to the roof of my mouth if I am unfaithful to these teachings." Now, there's no one like that today. So we have the president talking about make America great again, but he never asked what made it great in the first place. And it certainly wasn't the military, and it certainly wasn't the economy. It was actually ideas and beliefs and ideals. I've lived in Washington now more than 30 years. I've only heard two people who've even had a historical perspective, apart from some rather trite cliches on July the 4th, in addressing the American problems in the light of history, and neither of them has done it in any extended way like Lincoln. So I would argue the American Republic is truly at a Rubicon moment. Will the founding vision of the Republic and freedom be restored, or will it be replaced? And America will choose to go what the intellectuals are already choosing, which is a left liberal view of freedom and the Republic, and it will end up in a completely different direction. And in my book, I argue openly as a visitor for a national conversation. Now, the trouble is, Alexander Hamilton, as you all know, in the first Federalist paper, he called for, can we see whether reflection and choice, those two things he mentioned, can show that we can create a free society? Now, we don't exactly have reflection and choice in the brutal incivility of the rhetoric of today. So what I've done in my book, I wrote as Warren kindly said, a Free People's Suicide earlier, and that was on the issue of sustainable freedom, which I think is fascinating. But in the debate that followed that, it was quite clearly apparent to me that Americans never really asked what freedom is. In other words, something far more basic and foundational. So what my book is a checklist of 10 questions which citizens, Christians or otherwise, will have to answer and see where they come out on freedom and the American Republic. We don't have time this evening to ramble through a whole number of those, but let me just mention 6 of them and then just major on the one which Warren put me as the question, and which really is the question for your series, which is about how do you sustain freedom. But let me mention some of the others first. First, where does freedom come from? It used to be said that New England freedom, came from what was called the ancient liberties of the English. But of course, in the 60s, that was considered waspish, and today that's thrown out as white privilege. Some historians argue that freedom came from the Paleo-Indians in the Northwest, which is a little far-fetched. But I think most Americans, if they're pressed, where did freedom come from? Polls show they would probably say Athens, democracy. And that's simply not right. And many Americans have no understanding how extraordinarily wary the framers were of Athenian democracy, which only lasted 50 years at best. So where did freedom come from? Sadly, many Christians don't realize it came through the Reformation from Sinai, not Jerusalem, Sinai. In other words, the book of Exodus, the story of Exodus and its freedom, and above all the notion of covenant, that was picked up by the Reformation. Now, if you think for a minute, when Rome became Christian officially in 380 under the Emperor Theodosius, as historians say, the church, wittingly or otherwise, copied Greek ideas and Roman structures uncritically. Leave out the Greek ideas for a minute. Roman structures. How was Rome founded? It was structured hierarchically. In other words, based on power, force, conquest. And so the Pope was the equivalent to the Caesar, etc., etc. And it was a Catholic layman, you all know well the saying, all power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely, Lord Acton. And he was actually critiquing his own church, and he stood against papal infallibility. But the point being, when power is corrupted, it not only oppresses the weak, think of the Inquisition, the slaughter of the Jews, and so on. Power not only oppresses the weak, it corrupts the powerful. And the worst corruptions of the church were under the power structures of the Roman Catholic Church. And the Reformation, not immediately and not fully consistently, threw them out. Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, Cromwell, they went back to Exodus. Now, if the Catholics went a different way, we've got to immediately say, we evangelicals have tended more recently, unlike the Reformation, to privatize, to personalize, to spiritualize Exodus. It's the forerunner of your salvation, my salvation, individual salvation. That's not what the Reformation said. Cromwell, for example, said the Exodus was the only direct parallel to what he was trying to do in the English Revolution. It was based on the Bible, for better or worse. Now, of course, Cromwell failed. And in England, historians called his failure the lost cause. The king came back. But what was the lost cause in England became the winning cause in New England. And the Mayflower Compact was a covenant. What John Winthrop spoke on the Arbella, model for Christian charity, was a covenant. And covenant was the heart of New England churches, marriages, and then townships. And John Adams called his constitution a covenant. It's actually in the wording. And in the 18th century, the U.S. Constitution, with a little help from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, but only lesser help, it became the U.S. Constitution. So behind the Constitution is covenant. Now, if you think for a minute, democracy has zero social content. All it tells you who's supposed to be the ruler. Now, there are problems with that. But covenantalism or constitutionalism is packed with social content. Love your neighbor as yourself and all sorts of other things. So I start there. It's very important to see in the present crisis, we who are followers of Jesus are the champions and the heirs and the advocates of a freedom that is truly biblical. And 1776 was largely, sadly not totally, think of slavery and so on. There you had the evil, there you had the hypocrisy, there you had the contradiction, but it was still largely biblical. We'll take a second question, very important. What do we mean by freedom? Gertrude Stein said famously, a rose is a rose is a rose. You can't say freedom is freedom and freedom, because there are all sorts of nuances, and freedom comes out in different ways, depending how you define it and how you see it. Let me just take a couple of the examples there. Lord Acton pointed out the basic division over freedom, and you can see it in America today, as you can see it in Athens earlier. Is freedom the permission to do what you like, complete license, or is it the power to do what you ought, what was called obedience to the unenforceable? Well, obviously, a Christian freedom is the second. We'll take another very crucial definition. Is freedom negative or positive or both? Negative freedom, and I'm using the terms that were put on the map by Isaiah Berlin, the Jewish philosopher. I remember him at Oxford very well. Negative freedom is freedom from. If anyone has any control by anyone or anything outside themselves, whether a colonial power or a bully or drugs or alcohol or porn, they're not free. Equally, obviously, sin. We need to be freed from. So all freedom begins with negative freedom. That's preliminary, essential, and foundational. But most modern freedom begins and ends there. Libertarianism, for instance. All that matters is you get the government off your back economically, get the government off your back sexually or whatever, then you're free. No, that's only negative freedom. As Isaiah Berlin pointed out, true freedom is negative and positive. Positive freedom is freedom for, freedom to be. Now, if you think for a minute, to be free to be who you're supposed to be, you've got to know the truth of who you are and what you're supposed to be. And G.K. Chesterton has some wonderful illustrations of that. You can see the importance of our Lord's words, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And you can see in our postmodern world, there is no truth. And there's no way for modern people to become free. Are we animals? Are we machines? Or are we made in the image of God? Depending where you start, you'll end up in very different positions. And real freedom is not the permission to do what you like, libertarian style. It's the power to do what you ought. Because it takes freedom from and freedom for. And the biblical view, freedom, our Lord's view, knowing the truth, freedom requires truth, character, a way of life, if we're really to live freely. And so, once again, we have the most realistic, deepest view of freedom, but we've got to make sure we're arguing for it powerfully today. Or a third question. Have Americans faced up to the paradox of freedom? You know, I watch people say, come to Washington, go around the memorials. The Lincoln Memorial is by far the most inspiring and moving. But people who've seen the Korean War Memorial, one of the more recent ones, are struck by the powerful words across it, freedom is not free. That too is brief, inspiring, and thoroughly memorable. And obviously addresses what Lincoln called the people who give the last full measure of devotion to their country. They die for it. But the paradox of freedom is much darker. And Americans don't often consider it, although it's deeply biblical. The greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. Why is it that free societies never last? If you take the history of civilization, 100 centuries, and pack it in, say, 1 hour, historians say that free societies only come in the last 5 minutes. Freedom never lasts. Sometimes it runs out into permissiveness, license, and anarchy, and rebounds into tyranny. Sometimes freedom-loving people so love freedom They'll do anything to be safe and secure. One nation under surveillance, and eventually they lose their freedom. And thirdly, freedom-loving people so value freedom, they'll do anything to fight for it, including what contradicts freedom. Take Abu Ghraib or My Lai and things like that. And so you can see various reasons why freedom never lasts, and the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. For example, take the ethical roots of that. Freedom obviously requires some some restraint. The only really appropriate restraint is the one I mentioned earlier, obedience to the unenforceable, which is self-restraint. But self-restraint is what's usually undermined when freedom flourishes. And so freedom undermines and destroys itself. But there's an even darker part of the paradox of freedom, and that is there's a tyranny in freedom and a freedom in tyranny. You ever noticed in Exodus how, as the rabbis put it, it took the Lord one day to get Israel out of Egypt and 40 days and counting to get Egypt out of Israel? And when they go after other gods, like the golden calf, or they grumble all the time, or they want to go back to Egypt, they even described Egypt in the terms that Moses describes the promised land. And at one point, the rebels called Egypt the land of milk and honey. And you can see that freedom requires responsibility. But at the heart of the Jewish notion of freedom and sin is an evasion, an abdication of responsibility. So to tell people you're free and responsible is actually very challenging, whereas tyranny, authority, obedience is far easier. And you can see so often people get along to go along and so on, and there's a certain freedom even in tyranny, and a tyranny in freedom because it's so demanding. And so we've got to face that paradox of freedom, which of course requires education to make people up to the challenge of it generation by generation. Or take a fourth question. How do we create a world safe for diversity? You had Ryan, whom I greatly imagined last week, on religious freedom. I don't want to cover what he said, but just bring that in here. There's never freedom and diversity unless you have freedom of conscience. The high noon of 300 years of American thinking was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993. And since then, there's been a greater sea change in America over religious freedom than the previous 300 years. Excuse me. And let me just mention what to me are the three dark R's that we're facing over this challenge. The first are what are called the reducers. Those who reduced religious freedom, freedom of conscience, to freedom of worship. Every dictator grants freedom of worship. The Chinese do. The North Koreans do. They all grant freedom of worship. And what they mean is what you believe between your two ears, as long as your mouth is firmly shut and you stay in your own home. That is not free exercise, as the First Amendment of the Universal Declaration has it. The second dark R are the removers. Religious freedom is freedom of religion. It's become freedom from religion, and you can see how 9/11 added to that. Even, say, English people like Richard Dawkins, he said when he saw 9/11, he saw that he had to get religion out of public life altogether. The removers. But to me, the third one is the most important, the rebranders. Go back to the revolution. It was fought, and they say this again and again and again, it was fought for civil and religious liberty. In other words, it was called religious liberty, the first liberty. But as you know, under the impact of the sexual revolution, the LGBTQ activists, they have rebranded religious freedom, and it's now a code word for bigotry and discrimination. And you can see what's threatened is the right to dissent, the right of freedom of conscience, and all sorts of things, which I'm sure Ryan covered well. I just wanted to put that in because it's a very key part of the erosion. The fifth question, and I'm stopping the sixth. The fifth, what is the basis for freedom? Americans all talk about freedom. It sounds almost easy and self-evident. But go back to the Bible. The counter empires, Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Persia, none of them had freedom. For Babylon, it was the stars that determined them. For the Greeks, it was fate, Moira, that determined them. You go on down the line. In the same way today, we're beginning to realize that the alternative intellectual ideas of our time have no basis of freedom. Whether you're looking at Spinoza or Freud or Marx or B.F. Skinner or J.B. Watson, right down to people more recently like Jacques Monod or currently Sam Harris, the so-called new atheist. Sam Harris's book on freedom has a puppet on the front, dancing to strings. And he says quite simply, freedom is a fiction. Freedom is an illusion. Now, we really got to understand that. Outside the Jewish and Christian scriptures, there is no basis of freedom. And if you make everything you believe based on naturalistic science alone, all you have is causes, determinism. There's no basis for freedom. In other words, once again, who are the champions and the advocates and the guardians of freedom itself in its very basis and foundation? We are as Jews and followers of Jesus. And we've got to stand up for it in a very powerful way today. One last question, which is the key one of your whole series. How do we hope to sustain freedom? You may know that Rome is called the Eternal City, although it's filled with ruins. And that goes back to Caesar Augustus, Octavian, who announced that his system, the Augustan era, would make Rome eternal. The system would last forever. Of course, it didn't. Now, no system has ever lasted forever. And if you go down to the framers, you see that the most daring thing they proposed was that you could create a free society that could stay free forever. In other words, not just win your freedom, the revolution, not just order your freedom, the Constitution, but sustain it. Now, no one's interested in that today, which is crazy. The question is, how did they hope to sustain it? Or, put another way, if we are not interested in their method, or we reject it, or we simply neglect it, what do we have to put in its place? The sad fact is, nothing. Somehow people just think freedom will just keep on going on, which is a muddle-headed thinking with all history to show that's foolish. But how did the framers think you could keep it going? Well, they didn't give it a name. Tocqueville calls it the habits of the heart. My own term for it is the framers' idea, and you can see this from right across the spectrum, from Orthodox evangelicals like Patrick Henry, Orthodox Christians like George Mason, somewhat vague Christians, but mostly Orthodox like Washington, across to deists and freethinkers like Jefferson and Franklin. They all believed in these things. And I call it the golden triangle of freedom. Just as the triangle has three legs, they had three insistences. First, freedom requires virtue. Second, virtue requires faith of some sort. And third, faith of any sort requires freedom. And if you're thinking rather like the recycling triangle, it goes round and round and round and round. Freedom requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, which requires virtue, ad infinitum. Now, if you think, and we're not going into it depth, we haven't time, each of those three is assaulted today. So take freedom requires virtue. They believed in truth, character, honesty, loyalty, all sorts of good things under the notion of virtue. You remember when President Clinton was impeached, some scholars wrote to the New York Times, the president doesn't need character. All he needs in the modern presidency is competence. And you can see characters thrown out, competence is put in this place in our managerial society. And obviously, faith is thrown out, and so is religious freedom, the third one. And you can see the golden triangle is no longer in place, and Americans do not have a sustainable freedom. Now, the question is, and I don't want to go talking all night, although, Warren, you encouraged me to speak at length. The question, of course, is what's to be done? Now, we have no time to go into depth, and let me just mention certain things briefly before I throw it open to you. First, some of the basic requirements are obvious. I mentioned Lincoln. We need today a Lincoln-like leader. I'll come back to that. Secondly, we need to have a clear vision of what the best of the founding, the better angels of the American experiment and American freedom really were. And no one talks about that today, except in cliches. And President Trump's Make America Great Again doesn't begin to get down to that. And then thirdly, we obviously need a restoration of civic education to teach that to every new generation and to the immigrants. In other words, the old American motto, e pluribus unum, was very important. Out of diversity, unity. And that was what was done in the public schools through the melting pot, thrown out again in the late 1960s. But unless that's restored, America will be all pluribus, no unum. And eventually, as Sam Huntington put it, immigration will put more of a stamp on America than the revolution. And you can see today, none of that's talked about. We have people talking about walls, which are needed, sanctuary cities, which I think are very wrong, but no one talks about the unum, the uniting first principles that are essential for the American Republic. So there are certain basic requirements that need to be restored, and that's relatively obvious. Secondly, I would say, in finishing, history stands as a warning. You remember Lincoln quoting our Lord, "A house divided cannot stand." America cannot continue half slave, half free. And I would say bluntly today, the American Republic cannot continue half 1776, half 1789. They lead in totally different directions, and the end will be disastrous if people choose, maybe unwittingly, 1789. And we're at that stage today when words are breaking down. And when that happens, think of Hillary Clinton's remarks about civility or Eric Holder's disgraceful remarks last weekend. When words break down, violence is never far away. And think of René Girard and his whole notion that conflicts like this end up in a spiral of violence. The climax is an assassination of a scapegoat, and then the whole nation rules back. That would be a tragic. I actually had that in my book, and the editors cut it out. They thought it was too pessimistic. But I don't think it's that far away unless something breaks in. The third question I want to make in conclusion is much more of a Christian comment. Many Christians today are very discouraged. And I would say two things about that. One is we've got to realize, shame on us. This is the one country in the Western world where Christians are a huge majority. So we take our, say, Jewish friends. They're less than 2% of America, but they punch well above their weight, say, in intellectual areas, in financial areas, in entertainment areas, such as Hollywood. And we, who are a huge majority, are thoroughly uninfluential. Or you take groups we disagree with, like the LGBT extremists. They're a tiny percent of America, but with far greater cultural influence than we do because of the Long March. In other words, the scandal is ours, and we need to repent and see a restoration in the Church of Christ. But I would argue something that Reinhold Niebuhr used to stress: the end is not the end. Well, please God, this isn't the end of America or the decline of the West necessarily. There can be a renaissance, a restoration. But even if it were the end, it's not the end of the kingdom. And as Niebuhr pointed out, the end in the Bible has two meanings. There's end in the Latin sense of finis, ending, conclusion, period, full stop. And of course, that's in the whole of life. We're born, we grow, we decline, we die. None of us will be here in 100 years' time. Here we are in the autumn, summer's gone, the leaves are falling. Certain things are naturally get to their endings. Now, sadly, in the Bible, there are times when people get there when it wasn't natural, it was more moral and unnecessary, such as, say, the plight of Israel in the 8th century. Israel was not threatened, the northern kingdom, by Assyria. Syria hadn't risen again by then. Israel was incredibly powerful, but they had to face their end because of their leaving the Lord and their injustice to the poor. So there are endings. But that's only one meaning of the end in the Bible. The other is the end as goal, purpose, objective, climax, culmination. And here's the point. The end is not the end. Through all the endings in a fallen world, the Lord is working out his great end with a capital E. So you think of the disciples discouraged on Friday evening after the crucifixion of Jesus, not having a clue of Sunday morning. Or you think of people in St. Augustine's time. Rome collapsed, and they believed that the church was collapsing too, and the Dark Ages were incredibly dark. But Augustine knew that the city of man may collapse, but the city of God would continue. And his vision helped the church form a bridge through until the rise of Christendom, and so on. So two final thoughts in these concluding remarks. First, one from the Jewish scholar who put the notion of covenant on the map, called Daniel Elazar, wrote 10 books and many articles. And in one of them, towards the end of his life, he said, you've got to remember that a covenant comes from a culture where oases are common. Think of an oasis. Now, he said, what is the secret of an oasis? No oasis is larger or more luxuriant or longer lasting than what? Its wellspring. And he pointed out that if faith goes, the culture, for better or worse, will eventually follow. And the deepest crisis, of course, as we know, is in America, the crisis of faith, sometimes excluded from public life, sometimes desperately distorted by the worldliness of the church. Again, we need to see revival and reformation in our own hearts and across the church at large. The second little story comes from the great charismatic Bible teacher, Derek Prince. If you know his story, he was a Cambridge graduate, and he was a professor in philosophy. He was an atheist. And when World War II broke out, he was sent to the Middle East, British Army there, and he took various books to read as an atheist, classical things, and the Bible. And in reading the Bible in the Middle East, he came to faith in Christ. And the day he came to faith, he was also given the powerful experience of the Holy Spirit. Now, the British Army at that time was in desperate state, 1940-41. It had retreated 700 miles under Rommel, and the class distinctions between the enlisted men and the officers were appalling. There was more water for the officers' horses than for the enlisted men to drink, and so on. It was terrible. Churchill fired the general, and he sent out someone else who unfortunately died en route. And so Churchill had to quickly choose an unknown general, and he sent him out. Anyway, as Derek Prince was praying in the middle of this mess, the Lord gave him this prayer. Lord, he prayed it every day. Lord, set over us a leader such that it will be to your glory to give the victory through him. He prayed this every day, and the new unknown leader gathered all the troops together, Cairo and Alexandria, and he started by saying, let us pray to the Lord of the armies to give us victory. And what followed was El Alamein and the first great Allied victory in World War II and driving Rommel back and so on. Well, my wife and I, Jenny and I, love that prayer. And in the mess that's Washington, we pray every day the Lord will expose the injustice, the evil, the corruption. But every day we add to that, Lord, set over us today leaders such that it will be to your glory to give us the victory through them. Who will it be? I don't know idea. But while we wait for such a person, we're not passive. We, as I said, we're the advocates, we're the champions, we are the guardians of the highest humanism in history, in the sense the highest view, not man by himself, but of human nature. Balanced, high, and realistic. And we are the heirs and champions of freedom. And now is the time when Christians should be in the forefront of this battle, defending and articulating and demonstrating in our churches what it means to live humanly, freely, and with justice, so on. But enough from me. Over to you, Warren.
Thank you so much for that. Wow, very rich presentation. I'm so grateful to you for the years, the life of study that you have devoted to these questions, and that has allowed you to distill without reducing. I noticed one of your dark R's is to the reducers. You are not a reductionist in any way, shape, or form, but you are able to say it in ways that make so much sense to many of us, and I'm grateful for that. And you've also stimulated a whole lot of questions. I'm going to do my best to get to them all, or get to as many of them as we possibly can. I did want to, before we jumped into the Q&A session, though, I wanted to remind everybody that as many questions as we have, we'll do our best to get to, all of them and even more if you want to send them. So again, depending upon the device you're using, either at the top of your screen or at one of the sides of your screen, you'll see a question tab. Click on that. It'll open up a box, and I'll see the questions that you type in, and I'll get to as many of them as I possibly can. The first question that we had, just a housekeeping item, we had a question, I believe, from Mark, asking if there would be a transcript of tonight's program. There will not be a transcript, but as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we will be sending a link that will take you to a recording of tonight's session, so you can listen to it, watch it over and over again. Not quite as good as a transcript maybe for study, but hopefully repeated viewings will cause some of these ideas to sink in further. And as I said earlier, you can share with others the links. So let's jump straight into the questions. Mark, you talked about some of these issues, Oz, but Mark, who also asked the question about the transcript, asked this: how does the corner of the golden triangle of freedom fare with postmoderns who are enamored with freedom as radical individual autonomy? Specifically, how do you, in this culture, talk about not only freedom, but the relationship of freedom to faith and virtue, and how can you be heard?
Warren, I was cut off during that, and I've just dialed back in, so I missed the beginning of the question. I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's quite all right, Oz. What Mark has asked about your golden triangle of faith, freedom, and virtue, and we are talking about that golden triangle in a context, postmodern context, shall we say, of freedom as radical individual autonomy. How can we make ourselves heard to a culture who has redefined freedom as autonomy?
Well, you remember Elijah with the prophets of Baal, 850 against him, and the people sitting on the fence and the royal family also against him. He didn't say, come back to God, or everything will fall apart. Prophetically, he pushed them out. He said, if Baal is God, follow Baal. Because he knew that if Baal was God, they couldn't. They'd hit their heads against the wall and so on. In the same way today, we've got to take a lot of these ideas without any insecurity, without any anxiety, and push these ideas out to the logic of what they actually represent. And they're absolutely disastrous. And that's what we must do with these notions of freedom. Is get people to really see what freedom is and where certain styles of permissive freedom lead to. And is that the America that they want? And have the courage to start with the negative and the prophetic before we argue for a better way. It's when people see there's a problem that they really start looking for a solution. When they put it in Luther's terms, when they're aware of law and sin, grace and the gospel shine brightly. And a principle of apologetics is contrast is the mother of clarity. When people see the alternatives, they go, wow, I see what you're talking about. And faith is no longer a cliche. So have the courage to get down into some of these crazy ideas in all sorts of areas, freedom, marriage, transgenderism, whatever it is, and gently but persistently push them out. Now, of course, this assumes we're living differently ourselves, and that's part of the trouble with the church. We're not sufficiently different to be able to say, look at this, here's a better way.
It's related to that question in some ways, because, or at least to part of your answer, which is that unfortunately sometimes the church is very little different from the secular culture in which we are from which we are a called apart people, according to Scripture. Caleb asked this question: where and how should freedom be taught? What is the role of education, educating our children? How can we do the kind of job we need to do? Many of us on this call, I would imagine very few of us are children. Most of us are parents and probably even many grandparents here. What advice do you have?
Well, great point. There's two issues at stake: education and transmission, handing it on. And I would just say, as the rabbis point out, what did Moses talk about the night of the Passover? Hundreds of years of slavery. Tonight they're going free. Does he talk about freedom? No. Does he talk about the promised land of milk and honey? No. Does he talk about the dangers of the howling wilderness? No. What does Moses talk about? 3 times he talks about children. And you can see from the beginning there, the Jews point out the schooling and families are more important to freedom, and of course to faith as well, than armies. And America's got it quite wrong again to make America great. It's the lack of education, and it's the lack of transmission. You take education, as I mentioned, the driving out of public education. That's mediocre enough, but civic education has gone altogether in the public schools. But take the notion of transmission, because that's touched the church too. We have such an incredible distortion of the present. I call it generationalism. It's a generational thing you wouldn't understand. Every generation is so different from others that you're taught to be suspicious, critical, consider yourself totally that's rubbish. No civilization can survive, no church can survive, no family can survive unless they pass their values, their beliefs from generation to generation. So in a culture increasingly secular, that means Christian families are absolutely critical. And from the earliest age, we must bring up our kids not only in the faith, but with an understanding of the faith, the Christian view of things like freedom from the earliest days, so they know that we're somewhat different. And this is what we believe, and this is how we behave. But families are the key, and then Christian education. I think myself, it's different for different families. Some people stay in Christian education all the way through, colleges. For my own son, he had a solid Christian family, of course, and then a Christian primary school. But the older he got, he was able to take on more and more of a different culture, and he went to a public university, University of Virginia, and thrived under the challenge of it, because by then he had the roots. I know that's each family is different, but we begin with our families, but consider not only education, formation, growth, but also transmission. Refusal to go the way of the generationalism and see them as completely different. No. When you divide churches into all the different age niches and so on, disastrous. In Christ we're one. And there should be an expression of that. Terrific question.
A related question, Oz, speaking of transmitting our values to younger people, we're seeing today a lot of young adults in particular. Many of them would continue to profess Christianity, who nonetheless are skeptical of capitalism, are skeptical of democracy, that they think that, for example, a socialist system, and which of course is primarily an economic system, but has political implications and context, is superior to say a constitutional republic aligned with capitalism as an economic system. Would you talk a little about that and how we should address sincere, honest, thinking Christians who of the younger generation who are struggling with what they see in our democracy and in a capitalist structure, and are asking themselves, maybe there's a better way?
Well, Warren, if you look at the 50s and the reaction to it in the 60s, many of the things typically American post-war had become rather hollow, some of them hypocritical, a massive revulsion and rejection in the 60s. Now you see a much smaller equivalent of that. There were things in the church that were just taken for granted. And suddenly they were attacked from the outside, and young Christians were open to the doubts and the questions, and they weren't really defended, and so they've gone to the other side in their opinions. But I would say, I've argued for freedom. I think we've got to make a much better biblical Christian argument for freedom. For example, I don't like to be labeled, but if you push me, I'm a kind of reformed Anglican. I also believe powerfully in the Holy Spirit. I'm certainly reformed in a lot of my thinking, but a lot of my reformed friends, they don't like the word freedom. God is sovereign, they say, but they don't think sovereignty is freedom. Sovereignty means God has power and is free to do whatever he wills, regardless of any interference or restraint. We're not sovereign, but we are significant, made in the image and likeness of God. We have a freedom for all the influences that are behind us. And I think we Christians have got to understand a biblical view of freedom and really be the champions, as I said. But here I come in. Freedom is not democracy. I'm personally rather chary of democracy, particularly under current circumstances. I'm along with Churchill. It's better than the other systems, but it's in trouble today. And I think, say, President Bush made a huge mistake of equating freedom and democracy. And I think that was naive, and we're paying for it with the Middle Eastern policy. Now, when we come to capitalism, notice we're not uncritical defenders of democracy. We've got to really put content in democracy, such as human dignity. Why does each vote count? Well, algorithms couldn't give a hang about an individual. Ethical systems like utilitarianism, the greatest good of the greatest number, couldn't give a hang about the individual. We actually had the secret to democracy. Warren, I got in my book, many people don't know this. What's the most famous American saying about democracy? It's the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Americans don't often know that's a quotation. It's Lincoln, but it's a quotation. Lincoln was quoting Wycliffe. And Wycliffe in the 14th century was arguing when the Bible was in the hands of ordinary people, not the priests only, you could have the possibility of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. In other words, the roots of even the saying were biblical. In other words, democracy in itself is not worth defending. It never, ever lasts, and it's in corruptions and tyranny. Plato was against it for that reason. Socrates was executed by democrats, not by oligarchs or by tyrants. So we're not uncritical defenders of democracy. We've got to put content into it. And I think the same is true, but rather different from capitalism. Capitalism is the greatest engine of wealth creation in all history. But as we all know, it puts an emphasis on liberty, entrepreneurialism, at the expense very often of equality, and it creates incredible inequalities and injustices if we're not careful. Now, what was the biblical answer to the craziness of a fallen world? Well, it was rest and refreshment and restoration every 7 days, and then every 7 years, and then every 7 times 7 years, and the 50th year, Jubilee. Now, was the Bible built in inbuilt restorations when the inequalities and the slavery got out of hand, workaholism, for instance. And we've lost that completely. So we're pro-capitalist, I think, but both in the generosity of the wealthy, and we've got to have some system which every so often rebalances without the socialist redistribution, which, as you said rightly, I mean, I grew up in China. I've seen communism at its worst. And the terrible reign of terror in France, in Russia, in China. I mean, the liberal left way is the end of freedom, and will end in terror, no question. But we've equally got to have a biblical balancing of some of the extremes of capitalism. When you take, say, John Wesley, my ancestor, Arthur Guinness, who founded our brewery, we became, at one stage in the 1920s, the largest brewery in the world until they split the differences between Ireland and London. But it all went back to John Wesley. My ancestor came to Christ through John Wesley. Earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And our family, I'm proud to say, I'm from the poor end of the family, but our family, the most generous philanthropists in Ireland, out of Christian teaching. And so we've got to inject a lot of that back into some of the extremes we see today of capitalism.
Oz, you've talked a lot this evening already about leadership. You've mentioned Lincoln, you've mentioned Churchill, you've mentioned Wycliffe, you've mentioned your own ancestor, Arthur Guinness. You said that we need a Lincoln, but you didn't know who that Lincoln might be. Can you say a little bit about what the character of that unknown future Lincoln might be?
Great question. If you look at American history, and I'm not a historian, so some of you might correct me here, the great reform movements have come from two sources, either charismatic leaders with a small c, no, it's not, I don't mean Christian charismatics, I mean people like Martin Luther King, or political leaders who are senators and higher. So a congressman has a tremendous influence, but they don't have the megaphone or the bully pulpit. Usually it's a senator or higher that can do it. And that's what Lincoln did. And you see in Lincoln, as you see in Churchill, a great sense of history, an immense sense of courage, and the ability, like Moses, to speak with his people, not like Hillary Clinton, call them deplorables. Leaders serve the people and identify with their people and love their people, and should never, ever have that elitist disdain that some of the people have today. But notions like that now, other people like that, just take the history alone. As I said, I'm not going to mention names. Well, I will. In my 30-odd years in Washington, I've only had two people use any real sense of historical depth in addressing today. One was Newt Gingrich, and the other, our Christian brother Ben Sass. I twice heard him speak for an hour with no notes, with an incredible grasp of history. And I'm not saying, they will be the people. I mean, I'm a great admirer of all sorts of people today, but there aren't very many who have the courage, the historical depth, and really speak to the American people in the light of the better angels. So that's why Jenny and I pray daily. The Lord will call out such a person, and we can look back, or those younger than I am, be able to look back in a number of years and see what the Lord did in giving us that leader.
Well, yeah, I want to be very, very careful to be nonpartisan here, but I too am a big fan of Ben Sass. I have heard him speak a number of times, and I completely agree with you that he is one of those men with at least by all appearances to have great character and great intellect. But Oz, let me push back on that answer just a little bit, if I might, stipulating for the record that I am an admirer of some of the men that you've identified, but they've all been political leaders for the most part. You mentioned earlier the role of art and literature, and for example, when you talked about the Jewish people in this country punching above their weight, I think was the language that you used in the world of entertainment. What's the role of entertainment and, shall we say more broadly, culture making in affecting the public conversation?
Well, when I mentioned charismatic with a small c, we could, widen the circle from Martin Luther King, like Billy Graham and many leaders in the 19th century. So I wasn't just saying one or two. But you're right, culture is incredibly important. And I think the little phrase that politics is downstream from culture needs to get into every Christian's thinking. What Richard John Newhouse used to say, the first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. It was the Greeks who made the polis and that sort of citizenship the number one thing for human beings. And they ignored much of the rest of culture. I mean, they had great culture themselves, but in their political stress. And we've got to realize it was the left in the 1920s that gave the notion of politicization, turning everything into a political issue. And sadly, that's happened across the whole country now. Business has become political, and sport has become political, and you name it. The sooner we can get politics out of many of these areas, the healthier it would be. But that means our culture would have to be a lot healthier than it is now, starting with families and the arts and so on. I love things you may have heard of the Wedgwood Circle. Mark Rogers' attempt to bring together financial angels with the money, with cultural creators, film directors, and so on and so on. And so there's a marriage of the finances and the creators in order to try and seed the culture. I myself am not a huge fan, say, of cartoons. They have their place. It's not the sort of thing I read daily. I don't imagine you do or either. But it's amazing how many young Christians are in that world of cartoons, really trying to influence it for Christ in a very responsible way. And that's terrific. And I'd love to see that in all the arts and above all in film.
Well, yes, Chuck Colson, of course, the founder of the Colson Center, used to say that salvation will not fly in on Air Force One. He often said that politics is downstream from culture, and he was fond of citing Jacques Ellul, who defined, who I think coined the phrase "the political illusion," which is that, which is what I believe you were saying just a moment ago, Oz, that it was the left that tries to define all problems as political problems. That was what Jacques Ellul defined as the political illusion, that all problems are political problems, therefore all problems have political solutions, which is, of course, an illusion, and they don't all have political solutions, which brings me to, I guess, my next question. It's also from Mark. Thanks, Mark, for all the questions that you posed here tonight. And that is, what is the, without getting into church bashing, Oz, what's the role of the church? I mean, has the church, is the church wholly blameless in this cultural slide that we have found ourselves in over the last century or so? Maybe even 2 centuries. I guess it depends on how you define when the slide starts, right? But since the Enlightenment, since the modern era of the early 20th century, however you define it, and what role can the church play? You've mentioned the family several times, but what role can the church play in leading us out of this current cultural malaise?
Absolutely critical, because it's at the heart of faith. I was talking about freedom and the republic. That's the public political expression of freedom. But of course, far deeper than that, and I said that in terms of the wellspring, as Alistair was talking about, the wellspring of it all is faith, and the church, of course, is the community of faith in Jesus. So we're a huge part of the problem. I mentioned the scandal. We're a majority, and yet we're supposed to be salt and light, and we're less influential than groups that are a fraction of our size. Now, you can go back and say, why? Sometimes, say, we who are evangelicals, I'm an unashamed evangelical. All the rude things are said about evangelicals. We are people of the good news. There'll never be anything deeper, earlier, and more wonderful than being an evangelical, rightly understood. But evangelicals, we've got to admit it, had a wonderful pietism in the 19th century that stopped thinking. So as late as the 1880s, how many of the college presidents in America were evangelicals, certainly Christians? And then we lost the whole world of thought and higher education. That was tragic. But then you take a completely different thing. And a lot of Christians are very good when you come to bad ideas. Pope Benedict talked about the dictatorship of relativism. And many Christians could smell a relativist at 100 yards. But many Christians can't detect worldliness, because worldliness is far more than ideas. It's the structures and systems of our world. So I came to Christ in 1960s. I followed Jesus more than 50 years. But when I came to Christ, what was worldliness? This is England, 1960. Worldliness was don't drink, don't dance, don't smoke. Well, I came from a brewing family, so the first one was a little odd and by European standards, but then came the 60s, the era of the counterculture and liberal freedom and so on, threw them out. They were, quote, little no-nos. But then there was no notion of worldliness. At a time, the world was more powerful than ever. Modernity, consumerism, technology, you name it. And you can just see how the American church is actually incredibly weak because it's worldly. It's shaped in many ways. I don't mean drinking, dancing, and smoking. It's shaped by, say, things like consumerism, the self-help gospel, and I'm not attacking anyone by name, but some of the horrendous preaching. And then you have the prosperity doctrines exported to Africa and so on. All these are things where the American church has been shallowed and distorted by being shaped by American culture more than the gospel. So the basic problem is us. We've got to begin with the church. But we are the church. I'm the church. And so, the four fingers come back, not just pointing at someone else, they come back to me. And it's a real challenge to have vital, loving community. I actually think that the biblical view of community, the church, is the hardest part of the New Testament to follow because of the speed at which we're living, the strung out nature of our mobile society. To have a world in which you love each other, encourage each other, hold each other accountable, and all the things in the New Testament, very, very difficult, and we shouldn't kid ourselves that they're difficult.
It's interesting. As I had an opportunity to interview the theologian Stanley Hauerwas a few years ago, and I asked him, as he's near the end of his life and career, was there anything that surprised him about the gospel or his study of Scripture? And one of the things that he said was that just how important it is to be a friend, that Jesus early in his ministry called his disciples just that, disciples. They were his students. But near the end of his ministry, he called them friends. And it seems to me that the kind of, relational investing in people to actually be able to call them friends and to be called a friend by them, is kind of what you're talking about. The just sort of the hard, basic blocking and tackling, time-intensive activity of being a friend and living in community with folks is what this fast-paced world really needs today.
No, well said. And I think there again, love and relationships, the heart of our faith. Abraham, a friend of God, and so on. And you don't have that in atheism. And the atheist is living in a chance universe that's cold and bleak in its ultimate worldview. And you look at the Greeks, the Babylonians, as I said, with their views of fate and so on. Can you have relationships and freedom and love at the heart of things? No. To be fair, we're sometimes unfair to our Jewish friends, and we say the Christian faith is all about love, Judaism is all about law. But that's actually unfair. You go back to the Torah, the basic commandment. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and so on. And love is at the very heart of things, which is why not to love, apostasy, is not just a matter of getting the wrong ideas of truth and heresy. It's a matter of adultery and the loss of first love. And again, we should, of all people in the world, we are the champions of relationships, love, friendship. You put it well. But we've got to get known for these things again.
Oz, I'm going to pivot in our conversation a little bit because we have some questions that I guess you could maybe say were more macrocosmic rather than microscopic in their focus. One is a question from John. He asks, "Is America a free country?" And I want to ask a related question, which is that what do you see? I know you were born in India. You're a British citizen.
China.
I'm sorry, I meant China. I'm sorry. And you are a British citizen who's been living in the United States for 30 years plus. You've traveled the world. What do you see as the sort of state of freedom around the world? I think there was a time in the 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall and other events that were taking place where people thought freedom was on the march, that freedom was on the rise. Can we still say that today?
No, not now. I'd say things. Remember St. Augustine, how do you understand a nation? You don't look at the size of its population or its army, or as we would say today, its GDP. As Augustine said, you look at what it loves supremely. And there's no question what America loves supremely is freedom. And you call yourselves the land of the free and so on. But just as the paradox of freedom is freedom's greatest enemy of freedom, people can begin free and end up as slaves. And so to an outsider like me, or to many foreign visitors, people are still going on about the land of the free, and all this stuff. There's no country in the world with more addictions, more recovery groups, and so on, than America. And the fact is that Americans have espoused views of freedom which have undermined their own freedom. And Americans are becoming slaves and addicts today. And as Christians, we should see why that is. You know, I read an incredible passage on Genesis, Moses and Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the most free, powerful man in the world when they started. Moses, the slave and leader of slaves. But halfway through in the 8th plague, Pharaoh's own courtiers are saying, let them go, we're ruined. But Pharaoh still stubbornly insists on his way, and by the end he's a slave to his own obsessions. And you can see, again, as the Jews say, freedom has two faces. The external face of freedom is what it does to its victims. Freedom becomes evil and then victimizes people. The internal face of freedom is how it entraps the perpetrator. And so again, as the rabbis say, something that starts as thin as a spider's web becomes as thick as a cut rope or a chain. And you can see freedom undermines itself, and you can see this in individual lives. Hey, a little porn, a little this, a little that, and you can see how many pastors are addicted to pornography, and so on. So America's not as free as it once. Now you're looking at the global situation. Remember the French Revolution. People were ecstatically excited by France, like William Wordsworth. Oh, the bliss it was to be alive, and so on. And then 2 years later, disillusion, the reign of terror, the guillotine. Now what happened? Well, they were naive. They didn't have a basis for freedom. And Burke, Edmund Burke, our great Irish orator, he was right. And I felt the same, say, the Arab Spring. People were so excited, freedom breaking out all over the world. They hadn't read Burke. It was a lot of hot gas, and it led nowhere. And now you've got tyrants all over the world. And you've got to say, as Freedom House says, that we're actually seeing a reversal of freedom today. And America's betrayed its own cause. And people no longer around much of the world look to America as the champion of freedom. You look at the mess in the Middle East, done in the name of freedom, and so on.
But it also seems to me, Oz, and correct me if I'm wrong here, or maybe amplify on this idea, that there's also maybe the seeds of restoration in that as well, because freedom, the love of freedom, the desire for freedom seems to be a universal longing in the human heart. And if we as Christians who have the source of true freedom at our disposal can become competent at talking about freedom, it seems to me that that could be a very powerful, very persuasive way of communicating with a culture.
Absolutely. Lord Acton is often considered the greatest historian of freedom, and the man behind the Acton Institute and so on. That's his idea, that freedom is the story of the development of freedom, is the story of humanity. But it never ever lasts very long. We've got to be very realistic about it. Freedom in a fallen world quickly becomes power. Can you have freedom in a postmodern world? No. You look at the Kavanaugh hearings. Naked, raw power. That's incredibly dangerous and a million miles from the American Revolution. You look at someone like, say, Kaepernick. Trump attacks him because of the veterans. I've never heard anyone say, you may have done, I'm sure others have done, how Kaepernick is so different from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King hated racism and slavery, but he appealed to the Declaration as the symbol of liberty and justice for all and the promissory note that should be cashed in for the blacks. Kaepernick is not appealing to the flag, the symbol, the pledge, the Declaration as the promissory note. He's disrespecting it. What's he appealing to? Well, in fact, it's increasingly others. He's appealing to ideas that come from a side that's much closer to postmodernism, to Antifa, and various things. In other words, 1789. Of course, Trump just attacks him because of the veterans and never points out the sort of first principles at stake in the American way.
As a theme of much of what you said and some of the questions has been getting clear about definitions, that words matter, that whenever we talk about a covenant, we talk about, we're talking about words. in words that have real meaning. And then I remember Genesis chapter 2, where God told Adam to name the animals, that giving being able to look at something and rightly discern its nature and give it a name that is true and accurate and reflective of that nature remains important today, and remains and has become in some ways the root of our current pathology and malaise. Is that a fair assessment or not?
Oh, you're exactly 100% right. Now, we've mentioned various positive principles: human dignity, community, truth, freedom. We could add to that, as you did rightly, words. Now, we've got to recognize the Bible has a creative view of words, as you described with Adam and the animals. In the beginning was the word, let there be, etc., etc. But you also have the destructiveness of words. Through words, humans can create their own human counter-reality to God's world, and that's actually behind social constructionism. There are no givens. There's no natural world out there, male, female, etc. Everything's socially constructed linguistically. So yes, you're right. And we've got to recover the power of words so that our word is our bond. And as I said it briefly in passing, when words break down, violence is never far away. And that's the terrible responsibility of, Eric Holder and Hillary Clinton last weekend. Shame on them. Words matter. Shame on President Trump for sometimes his appalling use of language and insults to people. Words matter. Truth matters. And civility is respect for words, respect for truth, respect for the person, and respect for the common good. And we as Christians should never indulge in the rhetoric of the whatever it takes type of thing, which the social media and the blogs encourage, sadly. Do something anonymously and let it all out. No. We're living before the Lord, and words to us matter. No, great point.
Well, as we're coming to our final few minutes, and I am very mindful of your three dark R's, especially that first one, being a reducer. I don't want to be a reducer. And so I don't want to reduce this very rich conversation and these very robust ideas and the discussion of these ideas to a few sort of bullet points. But I do think it might be not inappropriate to ask, after an hour and a half of the conversation that we've had, what would you want our viewers and listeners to do when we hang up here in just a few minutes, or tomorrow when they wake up and they reflect on what we have discussed? How would you want their behavior to change? What would you want them to say and do to their neighbors or to their families or to their fellow churchmen and women and co-workers?
Gosh, there's so much I can say. But let me just say two things. One, we've got to have the deepest analysis of the problems. And again, I live in Washington. I read David Brooks' article today about the whole problem is a clash of rich white men. That's absolutely ridiculously shallow in terms of what's happening in our culture. So we've got to have the analysis right. But the far more important thing would be the second. We've got to have incredible confidence in the gospel. It is true. It is the most profound truth about the universe, about human nature. And we've got to stand on that with courage and without any nervousness or anxiety at all. And beginning with our own families, just bring up our kids to understand this and realize what an incredible privilege. We're not on the back foot. We are the guardians of the best news ever. So those two things, you can think of a lot of smaller details in what we said, but let's be sure we're analyzing the crisis at its depth and not accepting any other shallow ways of doing it, and not falling into politically correct ways of doing it one side or the other. But secondly, a glorious new confidence in the gospel.
Well, Oz Guinness, I can't think of a better way to end our time tonight than with those very words, that that we should have this tremendous confidence in the gospel because it is true and because it is transformative. And for those reasons, so we can be people of hope. And, it's easy to look out at the world and to be less than hopeful. But as you've reminded us, the end is not the end, that God is working out a marvelous tapestry, a marvelous story, and we only see a particular moment in that story. So thank you, Oz, for reminding us of that tonight. I'm so grateful, again, for you, for your books, many of which have had a tremendous impact on me. I know Chuck Colson himself used to comment so favorably about the work that you've done and how formative it was in his life. And we use these books in our Colson Fellows program. And of course, we've had the privilege of having you, Oz, at our Wilberforce weekend. And with that, I'd like to bring our time to a close with just a couple of housekeeping items. We do have every year a Wilberforce weekend. As I said, Oz was the speaker there a couple of years ago. We've got a growing lineup of speakers that will be back with us in May of 2019. They include Star Parker. They include Rick Warren. They include John Lennox. Andrew Peterson, who was with us in 2018, will be back again in 2019. For those of you who were there, you will remember what a great addition he was to our Wilberforce weekend. If you'd like to know more about the Wilberforce weekend, I direct you to the address on the screen, which is wilberforceweekend.org. And you'll see more details. And the reason I wanted to mention it now, even though it's many months away, is because we do have some special early bird pricing if you would like to sign up for the Wilberforce weekend. I also want to mention to everyone that we have a Colson Fellows program. The Colson Fellows program is a deep dive, 9 to 10 month long program into Christian worldview. We read some of Oz's books. We will hear Oz more in webinars during the Colson Fellows program. And if you'd like to know more about the Colson Fellows program, in other words, if what you've heard tonight just whet your appetite for more Oz Guinness and more of the ideas that we've discussed, I'd strongly encourage you to go to the Colson Fellows website and you can find out more about the program. That is colsonfellows.org. And finally, in closing, let me just remind everyone that we have been recording tonight's session. You will be getting an email from us tomorrow with a link that will allow you to watch this hour and a half over and over again as often as you would like, and to share it with those in your sphere of influence. We want you to feel free to do so. We want tonight's session not just, as I said, to be educational and edifying to you personally, but also as a tool that you can use to equip those in your sphere of influence with some of the same ideas and arguments that you've benefited from tonight. So with those housekeeping items, let me just bid us adieu. Oz, let me just say one more time, we are so grateful for our friendship, the friendship that we have here at the Colson Center with you. We're so grateful for your work and all your many books, including, of course, your most recent book that we've talked about a moment ago, The Last Call for Liberty, How America's Genius for Freedom Has Become Its Greatest Threat. So, Oz, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Oh, thank you, Warren, and God bless you all, wherever you are.
Yes, and indeed, let me echo what Oz just said. God bless you all. Have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday night, 8 o'clock Eastern, for the third episode of our short course, Freedom, Can It Be Sustained? Till then, God bless you. Have a great week.